our discussants today. To start with, of course, both Ritu Dewan and Nikhil Dey first asked me who chose the topic. And I had to say, not me, you. And I think you have very nicely explained why you have such a provocative, and I think it gives them a lot of thought too. But, maybe they disagree with some of what you say. I want to hear the different points of view. So I'm going to quickly move on to our discussants. I'm going to start with Mr. Nikhil Dey. Let me do a quick introduction, though he doesn't need an introduction to this audience. Nikhil Dey is a renowned social activist and has been part of the decision-making collective of Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangatna, or MKSS as it is known, since 1990. He also plays a vital part in organizations such as Suchna Evam Rozgar Adhikar Abhiyan and the National Campaign of People's Right to Information. In fact, all these organizations together have played a pivotal role in ensuring a powerful and unique Right to Information Act for India, and have had to work constantly to prevent its dilution, and it's an ongoing and losing battle. He's also been involved in struggles of the poor for justice, including grassroots struggles for land, the payment of minimum wages, as well as a fight against the blatant siphoning of welfare funds, which are meant for ordinary people. To my mind, one of the biggest contributions of all the organizations that he's worked with is to empower people and make them, the poorest and the least literate people today are aware of their right to information, right to work, right to food, and protection of other human rights guaranteed under the Indian Constitution. So without much ado, I'm handing over to Nikhil Dey for his comments on Dr. Mehta's talk, as well as his own views on the subject today.
Thank you, Sucheta, and thank you to Moneylife Foundation for organizing this kind of lecture on RTI, because I think far too often RTI is seen in very narrow technical terms. Even when we talk about the collapse of RTI, or we talk about RTI being able to, what kinds of changes has it meant in this country and not. And this very broad political context that Dr. Mehta has laid out for all of us is, I think, extremely interesting and extremely important to talk about. Now, I have a short period of time and I don't want to, but I do want to start off by saying that the subject itself troubled a lot of people, because I think what we really do need to do is define what we mean by civil society. I think, and Dr. Mehta put out this very provocative sort of line of the collapse of civil society and talked about what he saw as the collapse. But I think there are many things that people see in civil society which is very different. And it's extremely important that we start to define it. Now, I myself am not a fan of the term, because I think the term itself confuses more than it defines. And that's going to be part of the reason where I agree with many of the details that Dr. Mehta has talked about. But in the larger picture, there are some things that I'd like to lay out. To start off with, I think it's great to have a political scientist view of RTI, of anti-corruption movement, of the entire political economic framework, where you look at state, society, economy, politics, culture, much needed. We are very often in the RTI movement too narrow about does Section 6 work or not, what's happened with Section 8, how have things gone. Whereas RTI, and not just RTI, what you started off with, the whole idea of accountability, what Dr. Mehta started off about, horizontal accountability, does it really matter or not? I want to say that the same context is a very interesting context of starting with economic liberalization. I was part of an organization that was born on the 1st of May 1990, a very small, tiny Mazdoor Kisan grassroots organization. Born completely as an anomaly. To have a Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan born in 1990 is a weird situation when the market is supposed to solve everything. It sounds completely half communist or something along those lines. And that's what most of the people in the Bheem tiny market said to us, that, Moscow ka bazaar khatam ho gaya, aap kya kar rahe ho? What are you trying to do? But what we saw through many years, and I'm just going to give that as a short kind of counter, what we saw through many years was that just the issues that Indian elites saw as this great, what Dr. Mehta said, now the economy is booming. Yes, it's a question of just fixing some kinds of accountability, everything else would be fine. The people who I worked with actually did not see it as going fine. They were not participants in this. They were not benefiting from this. And that whole period of 1990 that we saw as a great period of growth, that story that's continued right till today. And that's why, to me, what we missed a little bit is, why did the 2004 elections go in a way where India was not shining? Why did a set of people actually, to the surprise of everyone, including those who got elected, say that no, we don't actually agree with this? And that produced for us a spark in a period which was not a small spark. That's what produced the RTI. That's what produced NREGA. That's what produced Forest Rights Act, which is much more fundamental, let's say, than even the Food Security Act, and a whole bunch of rights-based legislations, which I agree are under attack today. Now, again, given the kind of time frame, I think on the Faustian bargain they talk about between capital and the state, civil society, as I know, is actually also the farmers' movement. Civil society, as I know it, is actually also the women who are protesting against CA and RC. These are the two most extraordinary things that have happened since the BJP came to power. And it's not just the first defeat in terms of the farmers' movement defeating the farmers' movement in the sense of the farmers being a defeat for the BJP government and for Modi. But also, if you remember, when they came in, the Land Acquisition Act was as much of a defeat. And so have there been consistently, and it is a miraculous kind of movement. It is a civil society movement. It is civil society that is not part of this Faustian bargain, that will not go away, that has been extremely, extraordinarily non-violent, almost like a national movement in a sense. It's not equal to a national movement, but it has the elements of that. It's across the country. It's been pan-India. It's brought many people together. And what some of us, like the RTI people, or let's say people who are part of these many small and larger social movements in this country, actually are not the main civil society. It is this, what you say, that everyone has been taken in by this totalitarian structure. I don't actually think so. I think I agree that there is an attempt by the regime today to completely take over everyone and everything. I think there are many strong resistances. I think when capital and the state together come together and try and thrust what they did not like about UPA 1 and 2, that people even within UPA 2 said that there is policy paralysis, that they did not want to go by even normal liberal democratic constitutionalism, that they wanted to thrust their things through. When they have tried to do that through land acquisition, when they have tried to do that through the farmers' laws, when they have tried to do that, even within the communal secular structure, there has been incredible resistance from ordinary people. And around that, civil society, as I know it, has also coalesced. Again, as I say, civil society needs far greater definition, but there is something outside capital and something outside the state, which Mr. Doval wants to attack as a war. Why does he want to fight that war? Because he sees that as the real threat. He himself says so in as many words. It's not as reported. You really should see what he said. It is just that in those many words, that where they see they could not stop anyone, and there will be the next one and the next one of that kind. Now, when that will come together to take on the BJP and the RSS, which has done 70 years, 80 years of solid work, I think there are two last things that I would like to say. One is that, let us say, during COVID times, not everyone did badly. There are some people, the whole Oxfam inequality report shows that just 100 of India's top billionaires made 13 lakh crores extra. So there is an issue of inequality that has run through economic inequality, social inequality, political inequality, that has run through right through. And that is a set of people, whether you call it Marxist or you call it anything else, they will struggle. and they are struggling, and they are going to keep finding formations to be able to take it on. And the second is, it's not unique to India. These are things happening all over the world. So I think also, yes, BJP is unique to India, RSS is unique to India, and they are the strongest machine in that sense right across the globe. But what the RTI movement has shown me, and I'd like to end with that because this is an RTI lecture finally, and I am an RTI activist, is that RTI, and I'll just mention these two laws, RTI and NREG are also miracles of time. They were of their time. Those laws that came in were of their time. But after they came in, that they have been protected by the people. In the case of RTI, individuals right across the country who are willing to be killed, who are being killed, and who are keeping at it, and you cannot stop them. You can amend as much as you want. It is something that has come out, and it is a strong democratic urge within the most ordinary people. And RTI in India is different from across the world. It's not these few Thai court wala intellectuals who are using RTI to do something. It's also them, but it's many, many others. And the NREJ, which is poor people, using social audits, using public audits, saying we will not even let our local guys get away with whatever they are getting away with. I think both those, Modi saying that he will use Narega as a monument of failure, and yet having to carry on with it, shows actually that there is, even from our side of that side of civil society, a very, very strong resistance. I think RTI remains and will remain, no matter how authoritarian, not just an irritant, but a fundamental problem for any regime, no matter how authoritarian it becomes, because it has unleashed something in people. And I think those are things that we need to realize, that those are civil society contributions. They are not compromised by capital who just wants to make money, and compromises by the state that wants to dominate it.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. This is a very interesting viewpoint, but I think there's no contradiction in one sense from what Dr. Mehta is saying, which is that all these movements, whether it is the farmers or the women, they have to all come together for another national movement. And that is an interesting question that I hope all our speakers are going to help us arrive at. Where is that going to come from? I think a lot of us saw a lot of hope in the India Against Corruption movement, and that petered out. And there is no sign of anything similar, which had the whole country excited. I think we'll move on to Professor Ritu Dewan. I'm sure she has a lot to say about this. Professor Ritu Dewan is a well-known activist, academic, and now a good friend and big supporter of Moneylife. She's the Vice President of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, visiting professor at the Institute of Human Development, executive editor at the Leaflet, and which is our partner today, and a trustee of the India Forum. She's also the president of the Indian Association of Women's Studies, or has been until 2017. She was the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics at the University of Mumbai, and the founder member of the first Center for Gender Economics in Asia. She has over 150 publications, including 40 books and monographs covering a wide range of issues. I'm not going to get into a long biodata, but over to you, Professor Dewan. I know that you have strong views too.
Thank you so much, Suchita. Delighted to be here, and delighted to be part of a discussion in which somebody like Pratap Bhanu Mehta is there and Nikhil is there. I was a bit, the entire context of the discussion which took place, at one level, it left one very hopeless, but also the analysis of it was really spot on in many, many ways. One may not agree, but I think it really raised new issues of trying to understand, particularly the role between capital and the state, etc. At another level, there is a space, I think, where which is still available, which consists of a large number of people. And I think Nikhil has pointed out quite a lot. And that's what I call the public in the republic. And, there is, there's a lot to add on to, as an economist in particular, to the things which you said, transparency and accountability. That is something we as economists face all the time. And increasingly so, increasingly even in statistical calculations, in calculations of GDP, in whether there's a formal or the informal economy which dominates, this whole thing of formalization of the informal, which is being talked about right now. And of course, even in things like budgets. So the control over civil society, of course, manifests itself in many, many different kinds of ways. And there is a concept which we talk about, a reverse transparency. So civil society organizations, whichever way we may define them in, have to be extra transparent, but the government is being extra secretive about everything. And I think it came to the fore. We'd been discussing it for about 4 or 5 years, but it came to the fore during what is called as a migrant crisis. But I think a movement in March and April last year, which is probably the largest migration or movement in the entire world, and something which the state, at least, not the civil society, but very much the state, I think should hang its head in shame for generations to come. And in that, I think now this is something which has come to the fore to many, many people. Things are asked, how many migrants are there in India? No data. How many died during the long walk home? No data. How many died during the farm protest? No data. How many COVID orphans or COVID widows? I mean, it's a very derogatory term, but that's a term which is officially used. Are there? Absolutely no data. So the issue of transparency, the issue of what the economy is, the issue even of a civil society, and the nature of the civil society rests a lot on what is the information. And when I say data, I say it in a much broader context. It also includes media. It also includes various other kinds of components which have already been pointed out. So frankly, I've started calling data these days the new urban Naxal. Don't release it, lock it up, put it, no bail at all, no discussion, keep it in jail all the time, but don't release it. But people understand. And I think this is the time when it's not so much the pandemic, but the state response to the pandemic, and the most uncaring and uncompassionate kind of a response which took place. I think that has changed a lot of the thinking. Of course, the farm protest, of course, the Shaheen Bagh, and very much so, I think the awareness right now, what is taking place after the policy or the non-policy changes. There are many other issues. I'm not even going to get into the kinds of constraints on civil society, even if we see it in a very limited sense in the name of organizations. So you have your FCRA rules, you have your change in procedures, operational, things, the ED raids which are there, the name of drugs, the raids which are there in the name of, so you name it and it is there. And it's not so much what happens in the courts. It's, of course, that is an extremely important issue, but also what happens is the process becomes a punishment. The process of dealing with this diverts the attention of the kind of focus which civil society organizations have. And of course, within this, I also lay a lot of fault on this concept of CSR, the corporate social responsibility distribution, which is there, which earlier was at least for so-called NGO activities, education and women and PBTGs and aboriginals, etc., etc. But now is totally constrained by specific state governments. And so therefore, I think the point which was made of party state is something which is extremely important and which we need to really go into in further detail. There is also, of course, I mean, you mentioned about planning commission and the discussions which are there, and of course the rights, the right to education, the right to information, the right to food. There are many rights which were fought and which were got for. At least there was someone to discuss. But now I think the role of civil society in policy making is something which is very important and which is totally, there's no one to talk with. There's no one to discuss with, nobody listens, nobody changes, but the policies are also made from the ground. And therefore, I think simple things like we all tried to do in Maharashtra during the pandemic, some kinds of changes, allocations to sex workers, to transgenders, etc., etc. So some kind of policy changes were there. And of course, the Farm Act, I think, which is something which is so essential. Or what is very obvious to us, many of us who traveled to Kashmir or worked on Kashmir, Dr. Mehta went, I was there for quite some time, is the total backlash of abrogation of 370 and the withdrawal in particular of the statehood. I think that is something which really, when we talk about civil society and we talk about these kinds of issues, it really has to be taken into account. That's a separate discussion which we can have over 2 or 3 days, but it's something which is, there's no going back, I think, now in terms of the responses and the feelings and the aspirations of the people of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. I'm talking of all 3 regions, which are extremely important. There is also an attack, if we see civil society in a broader context, on labor rights and on workers. And this is done, as we know, through the labor codes, where the preamble says very clearly, and I think this came out very sharply in the lecture of Dr. Mehta today, is, what are reforms for? Reforms in quotes. And the labor codes very clearly say in their preamble that labor reforms and labor codes are taking place for the ease of doing business. So this whole change between capital and labor, between wages and profits, some points of, how the inequality component, etc. And the process of what I call, of course, development has become a bad word, as we know. It's growth, which is really being talked about all the time. But what we see, you see every indicator, whether it is NFHS data or any national or international indicator, it is a process of what I call de-equalization. It's not as if things were very perfect earlier, but I think things are much, much worse, and we are really in a reverse mode in many of these ages which are going. There is much more to say, but I think I will stop here and maybe get into the discussion at a later point. Yes, we have been downgraded from democracy to a flawed democracy just a few weeks ago. And also, I think the majoritarian appropriation, and that appropriation of thought, of action, of policy, of deed, etc. But there is also a large segment of people who lie outside this entire debate between the state and between whether it's the corporate or whether it's the party structures, etc. And I think that's one area, and Nikhil has said some, I've mentioned a few, whether it's workers or capital or transgenders, aboriginal tribes who are suffering the most during this process of monetization. I think there's also a whole lot of inspiration that we need to take from here. Thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ritu. It's very kind of you. I've listened to you and Nikhil, and I think in many ways you sort of underline what Dr. Mehta has said. You pointed out more areas where there are segments of civil society working doggedly, as he points out. But how do they all coalesce into one national movement? As a layperson, I'm still not clear. I also hear this viewpoint all the time. Those of us who have seen the emergency, we know that completely, poor people who are never even taken into account are the ones who actually vote and can overthrow governments. So maybe even today we are not talking to them. Maybe the government knows a little bit about it, which would probably explain the rollback of the farm laws. I would like Dr. Mehta to respond to both the speakers. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts and a lot of comments. Maybe hear from you on both of their interventions.
Thank you very much, both to Nikhil and Professor Diwan. In fact, these are exactly the kinds of comments I'd hope to provoke, and particularly Nikhil's sort of spirited defense, which I actually agree with. So let me try and respond to, I think, Nikhil's comments. I don't disagree with anything he says. I mean, in terms of, I think, the the description of the existence of various kinds of movements and activism. And he rightly chided me for saying, okay, where's the definition of civil society? What do you think all of these people are doing, right? But let me push back against it a little bit in the following sense. So let's all agree that RTI activists are still an extraordinarily potent force, and as he rightly said, most of them actually are not, in some senses, privileged. It's still a extraordinary tool. Let us all agree. Let us also posit and agree. We've written about it. Both the CAA and the farmers movement, in some senses, were genuine social movements. In some senses, right? But I think it is also worth asking, okay, what do the limitations of these movements actually tell us about this political movement? Okay. To my mind, the CAA movement was an extraordinary political articulation. It invented, in a sense, almost a new grammar of protest in some ways. But let's face it, this is the brutal fact. It did not draw support from a large cross-section of Hindus. There's no denying this fact. Okay? In that sense, if you think of civil society, right, in the kind of classic normative sense of civil society as a project in which citizens engage together to build something of a common life, right? I don't think, I mean, in fact, I actually think in that sense, the CA actually revealed so much about us, right? The fact that politicians, right, and if you look at across the political spectrum, maybe they're misreading the public mood, right? But the fact that no political party seriously is willing to take on communalism is telling you something. It's telling you something about the way in which they are reading the structure of civil society articulation and the kind of institutionalization of poison and vigilantism across the board. Okay, so it's precisely because the CA movement was so important, so poignant, so wonderful, right, that the fact that it could not even give us that confidence of being that bridge builder, I think give us some pause in a sense about, you know, what the limits are. I'll be provocative about the farmers movement. I think the farmers movement was absolutely extraordinary, and you know, certainly I think in its ability, in its staying power, in its grittiness, in the tenacity, in the fact that it held together. No mean achievement for any institution, organization, or movement in some senses in India. But let us ask the next question, and that's really where the issue about civil society comes in, right? So civil society has performed a great many functions. During the pandemic, for example, there were striking examples of civil society filling in where the state had abdicated, right? So it performs social, service delivery functions. Civil society is still very active in some senses in demanding accountability in the sense that Nikhil outlined, right? But if you take, in a sense, the broad macro diagnosis I was trying to, in a sense, articulate, right, that you have a conjuncture where the economy is kind of stuck. Whether it's regressed or not, we can debate. My own sense is the economic performance of the government will be middling. It won't be the disaster that the critics politically hope it might be. But even in agriculture, right, where you actually do have an agriculture, you do have a crisis in Punjab, a serious crisis in Punjab, right? Punjab's political economy has been deeply stuck in an environmentally unsustainable agricultural regime, in electricity subsidies that are completely unsustainable. I mean, 110,000 crores in the last 8 to 9 years, right? Now, as an oppositional movement, the farmers' movement was absolutely wonderful. Okay, this is the way the Modi government went about reforming, and the content of those reforms was not going to solve any of the fundamental problems of Indian agriculture, right? But what is the equilibrium that is going to be coming out of it? Is the equilibrium that is going to be coming out of it one which civil society actually demonstrates the ability to say, okay, here is a common future we need to build. You not always get consensus. I mean, people don't have to agree. But here is a common future that we need to build that breaks away from the current equilibrium in which we are trapped, and that systematically comes back to haunt us. This agriculture debate has been around. I mean, in a sense, the last 15 years, every time we will be back to the same structure. You look at the Punjab elections, right? And you look at what's on offer from all the political parties, frankly, it should make you nervous. It should make you nervous, not because farmers don't have interest to be protected, but it makes you nervous because it, in a sense, it does not fulfill at least one of the perhaps more utopian hopes we have from civil society, to be able to create forms of conversation where we can build a common policy and a common life together, right? And I think that's the sense in which, and that's the vacuum in which then authoritarianism intercedes. Because then authoritarianism can say, look, all you have in civil society is, and that's their construction, is a collection of particular interests. Some vested interests may win sometimes, some may be more powerful, but the framing is still, civil society does not in some senses contribute to the solving of particularly these kinds of wicked problems, right? The form of urbanization, agricultural transformation, the kinds of things Professor Diwan is talking about. I mean, frankly, what should be the basic development model in some ways, right? And I think the impatience around civil society around that, I think, will still remain. I actually, precisely because all that Nikhil has said is true, I'm a little bit more, I think, pessimistic in some ways, that you will just get this demand for, in a sense, authoritarian, I think repression in some senses recurring. There will be brave people fighting it. There will be movements that in a contingent sense will arise from time to time that resist it, right? But do they move us to the equilibrium of, the governance architecture that Nikhil is talking about? Very difficult to see that. Very difficult to see that even at the state level. A couple of states apart, in some senses, what the center is doing is, extrapolating the kinds of techniques that were perfected at the level of state politics up to the center. That's the sense in which I think there are harder questions that need to be asked about. The social movements are necessary conditions, but they are a long way not only from being sufficient, right? But if they're not channeled politically in some ways, right, they can actually create the conditions of their own repression sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. I'm sure Nikhil wants to respond to that. But before that, we have with us Mr. T.S. Krishnamurthy, former Chief Election Commissioner. Mr. Krishnamurthy, would you like to say something?
Well, I have been watching it for the past 15-20 minutes because unfortunately I couldn't get the connection earlier. But I know Mr. Bhanu Mehta's views and others' expressions that I heard that about the way the civil society functions in India. My only regret is that civil societies, particularly the political parties, have not been using it with some kind of a respect to the rule of law. Many of the civil societies have become tools of the political parties. With the result, the rule of law seems to be taking a back burner. So my only point that I would like to stress is civil societies, whatever agitations they have, whatever viewpoint they have, they must not sacrifice the rule of law principle and agitate, apart from whatever protest that you may make, they must agitate only in the courts of law. By resorting to violence or hatred, civil societies may not achieve the desired purpose. That's my view. The second thing I wanted to mention is that political parties are the weakest link in India, in Indian democracy, and they are responsible, all of them. I'm not singling out any particular party. All political parties have been irresponsible in shaping or in regularizing or in airing or even supporting the civil societies in a proper form. So my regret is the weakest link in our democracy needs to be reformed. I don't know. I have made a lot of suggestions in my book as well as in my speeches. Unless the political parties learn to be responsible in their criticism, accountable to the court of law, civil societies will always find misdirected leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Krishnamurthy. I'm sure there are very, very strong views about what you say as well. And I'm sure some of the members of the audience would like to speak about it. We have a lot of very strong activists here. Before I come to Nikhil and Ritu again to react, may I ask Ms. Shukla Sen to unmute, and you raised your hand, and I'm sure you have some important questions to raise.
Thanks to Dr. Mehta for the brilliant presentation. Fine, that's one point. The second point, as I see, the talk can be divided into two parts. First part, what is happening today, why it is happening, how it is happening. The second part is the concluding part, that the civil society stands dismantled. Mr. Nikhil Dey has already challenged the second part. I'm not getting into that. I have a question relating to the first part. I've already put up in the chat box, but I would repeat in brief. That in Dr. Mehta's presentation, when he talked about the 5 aspects of the Indian state and society between 1991 and 2014, the last aspect, that is the economic aspect, it sounded like the other 4 aspects and the economic aspect, the economic reform, they are actually symbiotic. I put up the question at that point of time. My question is that there is a strong strand of thoughts which consider that what is happening today, the absolutely utterly disturbing transformation that India is undergoing, is actually dictated by what was happening in the economic sphere. I am personally not too clear about it. I would like Dr. Mehta's comment on that. I would just add one sentence here. He talked about Faustian bargain. I still remember before 2014 poll, Gurcharan Das, he commented that if we are compelled to choose between secularism and reforms, we would choose the latter. And in fact, one may very well read democracy, quote unquote, democracy instead of quote unquote secularism. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Sen. I think our speakers would like to react. So, Mr. Mehta, would you go first, and then Nikhil and Ritu?
Oh, Nikhil should go first. I've spoken long enough. Always great to hear Nikhil.
Sure.
Yeah, should I?
Yes, Nikhil.
Should I speak? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll try to be brief and actually go back to one of your lines, which I tried to write down. By the way, your speech should be transcripted, and you should put it together into something so that this can become an issue of debate. And it really is something of great value. And just as you said, there's much that you agree with what I said. There's much that I agree with what you said. But I think that there are some things. So where you said, can civil society foster, I'm paraphrasing, foster a conversation and that produces a legitimate solution. And in a sense, you seem to be saying that the policymakers and the powers that be managed to say that civil society is basically policy paralysis. They may raise issues, but they don't do anything that's of real value. Let's start with the issue of agriculture. I think that the whole thing of what's happened in agriculture, we don't have the time to go into it, has been thrust upon one particular region in the country. And then it produced as a result of that. And we have never fostered a conversation. If there has been a conversation, and whether it is health or whether it's education or whether it's climate change, which actually we have a pathetic conversation going on around, the only people who really have valuable conversations, and I mean that whole range of civil society, because it is a very big spectrum. But there are people who are looking at issues in the society, in social movements. They combine with people who are academics. They combine with people on the ground. And I think that is something that India, from the time of its national movement till today, it has. And so when you say, can it produce it? Today, there is no space for a conversation. Absolutely. They want to snuff it out. And that's what Mr. Doval wants to do and Mr. Modi wants to do. And the biggest thing that they want to do is stop freedom of expression in any form at all, because they don't want that space to emerge. And they just want to thrust through whatever. And the corporate sector does want it. So the so-called reforms in agriculture were brought in along with the corporate sector, backing it all the way, being the cheerleaders all the way, preparing to reap the benefits from it, and actually not involving the people themselves. And it's not just Punjab, Haryana, it's across the country that this crisis needs many, many, many more conversations. If it's anything that civil society has matured in, I think, over a period of time, it is fostering those conversations. And I say this with, I'm not saying that civil society is able to those conversations to prove, but at least it fosters them that they are much better quality conversations. And I think you would know that as much as I do in the crisis in education, in the crisis in climate change, in the crisis in agriculture. That's one thing I do want to say. And one other thing that I do want to say is that because of the title, I think it's brought to, in a sense, it's focused on an area where we say that if this is something that the state is wanting to do, no disagreement at all. That the state in India, the totalitarian or party state, as you call it, is managing to do. Every institution has actually been co-opted. But I think it's one area that has not been co-opted. It's the people who are actually suffering the outcomes of all these policies being thrust from above. And in that sense, if democracy and civil society come together, it is that those people are being able to find their voice, and we have to be able to give that space and recognition also, rather than say that they are not doing it. I mean, the farmers' movement is not a revolution. The farmers' movement is an incredible, not just even CA. And sorry, there's one thing that I would like to say. It is absolutely true that CAA did reveal that all of us did not stand by those women and the whole community that we absolutely should have, while our secular structure was being torn apart. But just as Dalits have fought and fought and fought and used democratic space to gain recognition, I think those movements actually gained recognition in this whole political power area, that you cannot just walk over them and trample over them and create polarization and get away with it. That polarization will also somewhere bite you, and that comes into this whole calculation. So they have value that we'll see in the years to come.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. I'm going to ask Professor Ritu Dewan for her reaction before we go to Dr. Mehta. But I just want to throw in one more small element, which is, we've always believed that humor is a way to reach out to people. And in today's discussion, we have not talked about the shutting down of humor, which is, to my mind, a very powerful tool to reach out and make people see things differently and look at themselves differently. So if, any of our speakers would like to comment on that, that also would be wonderful. Over to you, Ritu.
There's so much to comment on that humor. Yeah, maybe we have to take that into account. And that's, again, I think, part of the civil society which has taken it up, I think, taken it up quite seriously, whether it's in terms of through media or discussions or organizing alternate spaces, simply, or just physical spaces to have these kinds of, whether Munawar or Kurmal Kamra or whatever. I just want to say one thing, which I find a little troubling, and that is expecting the civil society to perform the role of the government. Okay. And when we say civil society, I'm including everybody. I'm including farmers, I'm including workers, journalists, Dalits, Adivasis, women's groups, finance groups. There are a lot of finance groups which are also functioning, whether it's in terms of budgets or governance or whatever it is. And so therefore, that a proper alternative law has not been drawn, whether it's the Farmers Act or whether it's anything else. So therefore, civil society should have much more discussions and much more meetings and put forward alternatives, etc., etc. Now, one thing, of course, which we do, maybe it's not talked about much, it's not circulated enough, it's something we do all the time and have been doing it even more in the past 4 or 5 years in particular. But also, remember, the civil society cannot entirely fill the space of the government and of a state. We faced this during the migrant crisis when the state absolved itself of all responsibility. And when I say state, I say it in the monolithic concept of the term. And therefore, I mean, Suchita and I were going over this, whether it was medical, PPEs to be provided, or many other, whether simple things like food and accommodation and shelter and, simple mobiles, travel, etc., etc. We did, and I think the civil society really shone at that point of time, the kind of work which it did. If we see civil society in the context of NGOs, okay, and charitable organizations, etc., etc. So that, I think, is one area also of inspiration, because the number of people who came forward at that point of time as individuals, as organizations, was very, very important. But also, I think I have a problem with this term legitimate solutions. Legitimate to whom? And when we say that we must have legitimate solutions, legitimate for what? Is it for the kind of state which exists today? Or is it legitimate for the constitution in terms of the constitutional guarantees which are to be done? Is it legitimate for private capital? I mean, just yesterday you have the statement coming out that, the Ambanis are happy with the cryptocurrency law. So now, is it going to become law? Does it have to be vetted first with the 1 or 2 individuals and not vetted with the rest of the... I'm not saying the law is good or bad. I'm not getting into that at all. I'm talking about the process of dissent, of debate, of democracy, which is what Dr. Mehta also talked about a lot. So my problem invariably is this issue of legitimate to whom and legitimate to what? Is it legitimate to the rights of those who are drafting it, whether it's workers or Dalits or women or transgenders, or is it legitimate in the sense of acceptable to the powers that be? I'll stop here, and I can talk for another 20 minutes, but I think I'd rather hear Professor Dr. Mehta.
Thanks, Ritu. Dr. Mehta, would you respond to some of the points made now?
So one, Professor, I mean, your point about legitimacy is absolutely spot on, because, I mean, technically, actually, the concept of legitimacy defines itself, which is it in a sense, that solution that is acceptable to all persons reasoning as free and equal people. I mean, so in that sense, it has to be, at least widely acceptable, if not acceptable to, everyone. But I want to make, I guess, 2 points, I think, quickly. I mean, there's a lot that's been said, but I think 2. One, I agree with Professor Diwan. I mean, the expectation is not that civil society is a substitute for government, or that civil society comes up even with solutions, right? I think the expectation is that when we think of civil society, you can think of it in very many different spaces. I mean, we can make all kinds of academic distinctions, but one way of thinking about it is it's a realm of discourse that is protected partly both by having to answer to the imperatives of power. So it's not, in some senses driven by the calculus of power in the way in which, let's say, electoral politics might or something else might, and that has its own legitimacy. And it's also not distorted, right, in some senses, by extraneous consideration of different forms of power, capital, money, and so forth. And in principle, I mean, this is the idealized conception. This is a space in which the exchange of reasons can take place, right? The validity of arguments can be assessed, and an all things considered view can be, in a sense, kind of generated, right? Now, it is often the case that the habits of argument in civil society will not always translate into politics. There might be good solutions civil society comes up, and politicians subvert them for their own particular reasons, or other kinds of powerful interests subvert them for their own kinds of reasons. But I think it is, in a sense, the idea that there is such a space in which it is possible to, through exemplarity, demonstrate what, all things considered, solutions to look like. And that's very closely tied to the conception of legitimacy. That it's not just, in a sense, me speaking from my perspective, from my interest. However, the interest might be legitimate, but it is nevertheless only still my interest, right? It actually has a way of imagining what it would be like to build a world that is kind of common to us, which we all, in some senses, take ownership of. Now, in that context, Chetaji's kind of point about humor, there's actually a larger point which I think probably one should put on the table, which is what has happened to discourse more generally, right? One of the premises of civil society is that, in a sense, civil society is the joint discovery of truth in some ways, right? We exchange reasons, we exchange arguments, evidence. We can even, express our interests, and our interests are certainly part of what needs to be taken into account wherever something is being decided. But what happens if you're in a completely different discursive world, at least amongst the dominant and the elites, where the purpose of his communication is not collectively seeking the truth, and very consciously, right? It is, in some senses, the expression of, or a demand for, a certain kind of recognition, where the beliefs that you have are a function of your identity, not the other way around, right? And in that context, the demand for accountability that civil society produces, and it's certainly true, for example, nationalism, right? I mean, in some senses, nationalism wants to occupy the ground of authenticity, of expressivism, right? It's very hard to combat nationalism through facts. I mean, we all kind of pretend as if the problem is misinformation. The problem is not misinformation. The problem is, in a sense, an investment in an identity that will allow us to construct a narrative that serves the purposes of that identity rather than the collective pursuit of truth, right? So often when we say there's a problem of misinformation, I think it misframes the problem. I mean, these are smart people. They have multiple sources of information. It is certain kinds of psychological investments where the purpose of communication is, in a sense, the expression of an identity, the expression of a certain form of domination, right? Rather than, in a sense, the collective pursuit of truth. And what has happened to the public sphere, in some senses, is actually that larger, deeper crisis. It doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what the content of your argument is, what its validity claims are, right? What matters, in a sense, is what's the provenance of the argument, who is speaking it, the easy attribution of insincerity to any utterance. I mean, one of the things in the social media environment is the asymmetry between truth and doubt, right? It's easy to generate doubt. And at one level, I think it's something we have not fully come to terms with when we think of the social media environment and the communication environment more generally. It's a little bit like what Europe might have felt at the cusp of the printing revolution, right? Which is, there is a whole new medium of communication that contextualizes, recontextualizes, decontextualizes, that erases the distinction between public and private communication. And what did that revolution do? In its early phases, the first thing it achieved was a complete decimation of all authority. I mean, that's what its great achievement was. I mean, and there was total chaos. And in this decimation of authority, the only way people could respond to it was, the only way in which you can make meaning stick is by a certain kind of authoritarian closure, right? Okay. So at one level, and that's the context in which I think the point you made about humor is actually important, because, you know, humor also presupposes stable communicative contexts, right? A common shared meaning in the context of which something is funny, right? Once it can be decontextualized, right, in ways in which you cannot actually control the utterance. I mean, you can take a quotidian example. Let's say any of you tomorrow, right? Just let's say you tweet a picture of Lord Ganesha on your Twitter account. Just, you know, something as simple as that. Think of the 65 meanings that can be simultaneously attributed to that act. Are you a closet nationalist? Are you genuinely religion? Are you making a Freudian joke? I mean, right? So there is actually something happening about our communicative context, which makes it, in a sense, harder to think of this communicative enterprise as the collective search for truth. And which is why our freedom of expression laws are all over the place. I mean, you have this irony where both the right opportunistically defends them. The left is getting more worried about where freedom of expression actually takes us. But I think that's the symptom of a kind of communicative crisis. And maybe we never had that, but I think social media has, in some senses, has, I think, exacerbated that.
Thank you so much, Professor Mehta. You know, I was planning to take questions and I love the opportunity for a discussion, but I promised my speakers a hard stop at 7 o'clock. So we have 2 minutes. And if you have a quick question, I'm going to give the first opportunity to Commodore Lokesh Batra, who has used the RTI Act very effectively to challenge the Prime Minister, no less. So Dr. Batra, may I ask you to unmute and...
I have just 1 or 2 points, quick points. My issue is the very fact that today, whether it's NSA, CDS, or Prime Minister himself is talking about the danger from the civil society, it shows that civil society itself has an impact today. They are worried a lot. Let's look at that way. And Professor Diwan has rightly said, when we bring out that information they put up is not correct, itself is a fear. Now, look at yesterday's question answer in Rajya Sabha, where they said, we don't know what action United States of America is doing on NSO. The question was put up in the parliament. And we have no proposal for banning any group called NSO group. Now, these are things which are coming out. In our RTI is brought out during the COVID time, number of things. Whether it was a vaccine issues, we could get the vaccine data. So watchdogs are must. We just cannot say civil society. I mean, they're very difficult to even define civil society, because one individual and one NGO, one PMO, PM care funds and all, one has to have be watchdog all the time, irrespective of how things are moving. That's my last conclusion.
Thank you so much, Commodore Batra. I think, again, no contradiction with what Professor Mehta has said. Thank you so much to all our speakers. In fact, all our RTI lectures are available on YouTube, and many of you have been asking whether this will be available. Yes, it will, and we will also have a transcript which will be available on Moneylife. I'm delighted that the 4th RTI lecture by Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta and the discussion that followed with Professor Ritu Dewan and Mr. Nikhil Dey has not only met but surpassed our already very high expectations, because all our lectures have been good, and today was really food for thought, chilling at many levels, but a lot to think about, a lot to discuss, a lot to debate. And all this is thanks to the support by Thakur Foundation and Dinesh Thakur for making it happen. And thanks all of you. I'm really honored to see how many activists are here today. So I know that this lecture is going to generate tremendous debate. Many of you have also been watching on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you. And thanks again, Leaflet, for your support. Thanks once again to our speakers, and good night, everybody.